Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me. If you cannot, please write in the comment box that you cannot hear me. So, we remember that we were doing My Last Duchess by Browning. We read first few lines of Last Duchess, and in this class, we are going to continue with Browning's poem. Last Duchess. I think Browning's poem. So, without further ado, let me share the screen and let me continue with the poem by Robert Browning. So, I hope you can see the screen now. Yes. So, the line that we stopped in our last class was perhaps and seemed as they would ask me if the dust, how such a glance came there. So not the first are you to turn and ask us. Sir, it was not her husband's presence only, called that spot of joy into the Duchess' cheek. Perhaps Fra Pandolf chanced to say her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much, or paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half flash that dies along her throat. Such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy she had heard. How shall I say? Too soon and glad, too easily impressed. She liked whatever she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. Okay, so very interestingly, the poem is about male gaze. The poem is about the gaze of the Duke of Ferrara. The Duke of Ferrara is exhibiting the painting of the Last Duchess, and somehow the painting or the painted picture of the Last Duchess metonymically represents Last Duchess body. The Last Duchess is absent from the scenario, but despite remaining absent from the scenario, she is not extricated from the male gaze. The poem is about the objectification of human body through artistry. Artistry or the art is used here as a convenient trope of objectifying female body. নারীর শরীর কিন্তু এখানে objectified হচ্ছে through painting, and this is how there is a synchronic relationship between gender and feminine body is rendered, is built up. So you build a relationship between gender and the feminine body in the text. The text is about drawing together or bringing together the body of a woman and the body of art. And Victorian discourse, Victorian literature, Victorian culture thrives on this interface, thrives on the creation of an interface between the body of the woman and the body of the artwork. It's about exhibitionism. 1852, the Great Exhibition. So it's about the exhibitionism. It's about display. It's also about narcissistic projection of one's own self. And this narcissistic projection of one's own self here happens through the rhetorical discourse of whom? Duke of Ferrara. I call that piece a wonder. So the body of the Last Duchess, or the entity of the Last Duchess, is rendered into, is objectified into, is confined within the within the fold of, or within the parameter of just a thing, just a piece, an object. Uh, Fra Pandolf's hand walked busily a day, and there he stands. Fra Pandolf was a dexterous artist, and it also lays bare the artistry of Fra Pandolf. Fra Pandolf was a great artist. Fra Pandolf tried to capture the external beauty of the Duchess in its exact replica, in its exact representation. So it's also about the exactitude of art. Art has to be exact. Art has to imitate the external or the surface reality in its exactitude. Art does not have to look into the inner domain of an individual, the inner world of an individual. The role of art is to picture the reality that is apparently present to you, that is externally present to you, that is manifest to you. And Fra Pandolf does it dexterously. Fra Pandolf does it quite adeptly. And this is why Fra Pandolf makes the portrait of Last Duchess almost a look-alike of Last Duchess herself. Almost a look-alike of the Last Duchess herself. There she stands. Will it please you to sit and look at her? As I was saying the other day, that it is also about not merely the personal gaze, but also about developing a camaraderie, a male camaraderie through the act of gazing. So it's the poem promotes a different kind of aesthetic of gaze, where gaze does not merely become a personal obsession the of the narrator or of the duke, but it also represents a collective consciousness of a generation. It also represents the collective consciousness of a generation. This is how this is how the male this is how the woman body is gazed at collectively by the opposite sex, by the opposite gender. This is how the artwork is gazed at by the opposite sex. And when the artwork is possessed by someone, it also indicates that the artwork metonymically represents as if the life or the body of a woman. The life and the body of a woman is represented by the artwork. Here, the body of a woman independently is not important, independently trivialized. Rather, it's the artwork that glorifies the body of a woman that is important. So, the framing of the body of a woman within a set of cultural codes, within a set of signifiers, is important. So the body of the Last Duchess here becomes a semiotic body. It's not the real body. It's the semiotic body that the Duke is in love with, or the Duke wants to look at. The semiotic body. Because the real body, the real corporeal body of flesh and blood, might act defiantly, as we get it here. And that's why uh, the Duke always wants the woman body to be a semiotic representation. That is, represented through images, through painting, through an ordered discourse. It's not in the uh, real corporeal, un, unputdownable form or uncontrollable form. Rather, uh, the Duke wants the woman body to be rendered semiotically. It's a semiotic body, not the real body that is making inroads here. So the painted body of the Last Duchess is not the real body. It's the semiotic body, and the the Duke is fond of that semiotic body of Duchess, as it cannot act defiantly, as it's silent. Silence is very important in this point. The Duke always wants to hear his own voice. And that's why anyone present in the Duke's discourse is silent. Silence also speaks about the quest for absolute power that Duke hankers after. This rhetorical discourse, this dramatic monologue of my Last Duchess provides the Duke with that absolute power over the rhetoric, that absolute power over the rhetoric. He is becoming all powerful here. He is controlling the discourse here. He always has to take charge of everything. He cannot let other people come in and start speaking within his discourse. That's why the auditor is silent here. The auditor is silent here. It's only the speaker who is speaking and hearing. The auditor is present but absent in the discourse. It's present but absent. Absent verbally, present physically. That's also being hinted at. So it's the semiotic body and the absent presence of the, or present absence of the auditor, that's making the discourse here. Changes like that pictured countenance, that is a semiotic body, that semiotic face. It's a semiotic. It cannot act. It's not the animated corporeal body that can defy the will of the Last Duchess. Sorry, of the Duke. That can defy the will of the Duke. That's why the Last Duchess becomes a semiotic representation. Semiotic means represented with a series of codes, with a series of signifiers in the form of painting, in the form of image, in a particular order. So image gives the Last Duchess a particular order that the Duke always wanted her to have, a particular shape, a particular identity. And the Last Duchess, being confined within that codified image, can never escape that prison house of identity. She is now in the prison house of identity as a semiotic body. And the last Dutch and the Duke adores her now just because she is no longer alive. She cannot act corporeally. She cannot revolt. She is just there as if alive. As if alive. He is just there as a picture, as a semiotic body which cannot force, which cannot revolt, which cannot act. If you remember Rabindranath's Tota Kahini, in Tota Kahini also you get the picture of a semiotic bird at the end, which cannot act, cannot speak, just utters things mechanically. So this is how power wants an individual to be co-opted in its ideology. If you speak against power or if you question power, it might be unsettling for the power to endure, to grapple with. That's why it's the power that wants to control you in its own light, in its own manner, in its own mechanism. If you resist power, if you refuse to conform to its ideology, you will invariably be eliminated from the discourse of power. And this is what is happening here with the Duchess. The depth and passion of its earnest glance, but to myself they turn, since none puts the curtain I have drawn for you. Before, before this, but the Duke could not keep the Duchess within or under the curtain. The 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 Duchess had her own choice. The Duchess had her own say. The Duchess had her own life. And seemed as they would ask me if the dust, how such a glance came here, so not the first are you to turn and ask thus. It was not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess. It was not her husband's presence only. So certainly the poem turns backwards in the history. It tells you about the past, about the checkered past that the Duchess inhabits. It was not her husband's presence only that could bring that spot of joy there. Rather, it was everyone called the spot of joy here. Perhaps Fra Pandolf chanced to say, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much, or paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half flash that dies along her throat. Such staff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. She had hurt, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. So it's the body of the woman, that the corporeal body of the woman, that was as if too easily satisfied. That that was too easily satisfied. So she liked whatever she looked on. She liked whatever she looked on. Previously, we get a reference to the male gaze that's objectifying the woman body, and now you get a reference to the female gaze, as if the female gaze should always be controlled by a particular male gaze. And in a way, the Duke is pointing out the loopholes of the Duchess' character, as if he was promiscuous, as if She was morally degenerate, and therefore, uh, she looked on, and her looks on everywhere, went everywhere. It was all one. So she could not discriminate between her husband and other things. She could not differentiate between her husband and other beautiful things, other things. Whereas she was supposed to valorize only her husband, her gaze would move around everywhere. Clearly, this line indicates the Duke's obsession for controlling the gaze of the Duchess. The gaze of the Duchess should always, according to the Duke, should always conform to the choice of the Duke. It should not be pleased by anything apart from the gifts provided by her husband, as if she is her husband's sole property, sole object. And it's also about the collective consciousness, it's also about the collective abuse of the female gaze in the Victorian era. The Duchess perhaps had that powerful female gaze. She had her own path of happiness. That path of happiness was very different from the path of happiness she was supposed to be happy. She was quote unquote prescribed to be happy because it went against the male gaze. The female gaze was subversive to the male gaze, and that's why she was more egalitarian, more gregarious, more social in her demeanor, in her approach. And her gaze was not controllable by, or not controlled by, the gaze, the overwhelming, the inundating gaze of the Duke, and that's why she was murdered. So the Duke represents absolute state of power that Victorian patriarchy stands for. Victorian patriarchy always seeks to circumscribe women's gaze, women's vision within a particular territory. It seeks to territorialize the woman's vision within a particular set of attributes, within a particular set of things. It seeks to give order to the woman's gaze. But the corporeal presence of the woman in the poem refused to conform to that gaze, to that circumscribing or circumscriptive, dehumanizing gaze of male dominance, of patriarchal dominance, patriarchal domination. She wanted to transgress, she wanted to transcend the binary uh, formed by the Victorian patriarchy, represented by the Duke. But when she wanted to transgress, she was murdered. Why was she murdered? She was murdered because her presence, her very presence, was disruptive to the hegemony of Victorian patriarchy. Victorian patriarchy could not endure any rebellious voices. The rebellious voice that Duchess represented. As I was talking about, it's not merely the individual gaze of the Duke that matters here. The Duke is representing a social system, a collective consciousness that seeks to dehumanize the woman and circumscribe the woman's gaze within a particular territory. And when the Duchess wanted to break the barriers, wanted to break that territory, she was punished. Her punishment was totally an outcome of her transgression. Her punishment was totally an outcome of a gaze that the patriarchy could not put up with, could not bear with, could not tolerate. And that's why she was murdered. She looked on, and her looks went everywhere. Why should the look of a woman, why should the look of a woman go everywhere? It should always be confined to a particular territory, according to Victorian patriarchy. And that's why the woman here was penalized. So it was all one. My favor at her breast, the dropping of the daylight in the west, the bow of cherries and some officious fool broke in the orchard for her, the white mule she rode with round the terrace, all and each would draw from her like the approving speech or blush at least. Terrace. So why should a woman go to the terrace? The terrace is a space that connects to the outside world, that connects to the outside space. If we again go back to Rabindranath's novels, you find a very dominant presence of terrace in them. So the terrace was like a liminal space between the home and the world. Between the home and the world. It was their only exposure to the outside world. But the Duke was not in a position to even permit that kind of an exposure of quote unquote of his woman to the world. And that's why he is mentioning it. And she rode with round the terrace, all on it would draw from her like the approving speech, a blush at least, a blush at least, approving speech. Why should a woman speak? That's a question that that Duke raises. For the Duke, a woman should always be silent in the pictured countenance. So there lies the dichotomy between the real and the semiotic. The semiotic body cannot speak. The semiotic body cannot give approving nod to everyone. The semiotic body cannot reciprocate to a compliment given to her. But a real body can. And that's why the real was replaced by the semiotic. The Duke adores the semiotic body of the Duchess, the body that is made of images, the body that is made up of images, the body that is the creation of a male painter. That is the creation of a male painter. It's not the real body. It's the creation of a male painter, Fra Pandolf. So when a male painter does something, present a woman, a male painter presents a woman or delineates a woman, and it's delineated for someone who is also very patriarchal, very chauvinistic about his appearance. There is no problem about it. So there lies the irony of the poem, that the Duke never loved the corporeal, cheerful presence of the wife of the Duchess. The 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 conviviality of the Duchess, the cheerfulness of the Duchess. Rather, he felt insecure by her approving, reciprocative smiles to everyone. So, this act of reciprocation should be stopped. And therefore, Fra Pandolf was commissioned to make a painting of her. Therefore, Fra Pandolf was commissioned to make a painting of the Last Duchess. Got my point? This is how you can again get at the interface between art and gender Victorian patriarchy or the Victorian social system thrived on. And it also thrived on the silence of a woman. If a woman would throw a counter gaze or a reverse gaze at patriarchy, the patriarchy would feel threatened, unsettled, unnerved to such extent that it would kill that woman. It would murder that woman. This is how a narcissistic patriarchal setup was developed in the Victorian era. Thank you. Thank you for listening to my class today. It's already 35 minutes, I guess. Yes, almost. So, thank you for listening to me. I told you, as I promised, that I am not going to take very long classes through YouTube. My classes will be of 30 to 35 minutes. So, I end here today. All of you, please stay safe, stay connected, and if you have any queries, please write back to me. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening. Stay safe and take care of your family and family members. My best regards for all of you and for them as well. Thank you.